a project fails, and by the very next Monday, everyone in that room swears they saw it coming. Someone says the warning signs were obvious. Someone else nods along, already half remembering signals that, at the time, they never actually flagged. This is called hindsight bias, and it might be the single most underrated force quietly wrecking decision-making inside modern organizations. Once an outcome becomes known, your brain rewrites how predictable it felt beforehand, and it does this without ever telling you it happened. You are not lying when you say you knew. Your memory has simply been edited after the fact. This isn't speculation. Psychologist Baruch Fischhoff proved it in a now famous 1975 study that still gets taught in behavioral economics courses decades later. Right before President Nixon's historic diplomatic trip to China, Fischhoff asked a group of people to estimate the probability of specific outcomes. Would Nixon actually meet with Chairman Mao? Would the two countries issue a joint statement? Would the whole visit collapse without any real agreement? People gave a real spread of honest, uncertain probability estimates, because nobody actually knew how the trip would go. Then the trip happened. The real outcomes became public knowledge. Fischhoff went back to the exact same people and asked them to recall the probabilities they had given earlier, before any of it happened. Almost everyone recalled themselves as having been far more confident and far more accurate than their original answers actually were. People weren't lying to the researcher. Their memory of their own past uncertainty had been quietly overwritten by the outcome they now knew. Fischhoff coined a term for this effect: creeping determinism, the tendency to experience the past as though it had always been heading toward exactly the outcome that eventually happened, even when, in reality, several different outcomes were genuinely plausible, right up until the moment it resolved. Here's why this keeps happening. Meeting after meeting, company after company. When an outcome becomes known, your brain treats that outcome as new evidence and uses it to reconstruct the past, instead of accurately retrieving what the past actually felt like while it was still uncertain. Pair that with a second, closely related distortion called outcome bias, and you get the full pattern that quietly damages teams. Outcome bias is judging the quality of a decision by how it turned out, instead of judging it by how sound the reasoning was at the time, given only the information that was actually available then. A manager who makes a well-researched, well-supported bet that simply doesn't pay off gets judged identically to a manager who made a careless, poorly reasoned call that also failed. The outcome erases that distinction completely. And once hindsight bias has already convinced the room that the bad outcome was obvious all along, outcome bias hands everyone a convenient person to blame for not seeing the supposedly obvious thing. Writer and former options trader Nassim Nicholas Taleb gave a name to the closely related habit of building a smooth, satisfying explanation after the fact: the narrative fallacy. Humans are deeply uncomfortable with genuine uncertainty. We don't like the idea that an outcome was just one of several things that could plausibly have happened. So, after the result is known, we quietly assemble a tidy story that makes the actual outcome feel inevitable, complete with warning signs that, in the retold version, nobody could possibly have missed. The story feels true. It feels like an honest account of what happened. But it was constructed backward, starting from the ending and then reaching back to select only the details that support that ending, while quietly discarding every signal that pointed the other way. Picture a real workplace version of this. A marketing manager greenlights a campaign based on the customer data available at the time, past campaign performance, current market research, competitor positioning, budget constraints, timeline pressure from leadership. The campaign launches. It underperforms. The post-mortem meeting starts, and within minutes, someone says, "The targeting was clearly wrong from the start," and someone else says, "I actually had concerns about this messaging early on." Maybe that's true, but often, what's actually happening is that failure has become the lens through which every prior decision now gets reread, and small, ordinary uncertainties that existed in every campaign, including every campaign that succeeded, suddenly look, in hindsight, like they were flashing red the entire time. Nobody in that meeting is being dishonest on purpose. This is simply what human memory does once an outcome is known. The manager who made the original call gets treated as though they ignored an obvious problem, when, in reality, they made a defensible decision under exactly the kind of uncertainty every decision involves, and the outcome simply didn't land the way anyone expected, good decision-making included. The same distortion shows up around hiring decisions. A candidate looks strong on paper, interviews well, has relevant experience, gets references that check out, and gets hired. 6 months later, it's clearly not working out. In the exit conversation or the retrospective, someone inevitably says there were red flags in the interview, even though, at the time, that same person was in the room nodding along with the hiring recommendation. This is hindsight bias operating on a performance review, not just a project outcome, and it is exactly as unfair here as it is anywhere else. The actual damage runs deeper than one uncomfortable meeting. When a post-mortem concludes that a bad outcome was foreseeable, blame lands squarely on whoever made the original call for failing to see something that, at the time, could not have been reliably seen by anyone in that room. That is an unfair standard, and unfair standards teach exactly the wrong lesson. People don't walk away from an unfair post-mortem thinking I should make better decisions. They walk away thinking I should make safer decisions, smaller, more conservative, easier to defend later if something goes wrong. Repeat that cycle often enough across a team, and the team does not get better at judgment. It gets worse at courage. 2 cases get taught in business schools specifically because of how cleanly they demonstrate this effect at the scale of an entire industry. Kodak, a company that itself had engineers working on early digital imaging technology, is almost always retold today as a business that simply failed to notice digital photography coming when the fuller picture, involving competing internal incentives, market timing, and genuine uncertainty about consumer adoption, was considerably messier than that clean retelling suggests. Blockbuster's collapse against Netflix gets the same treatment. Today, it sounds like an obvious, practically inevitable outcome that anyone paying attention should have predicted. But the actual competitive landscape at the time involved real, unresolved uncertainty about which pricing model, which distribution method, and which technology curve would actually win out. In both cases, the story we tell today is far cleaner, far more obvious, and far more inevitable sounding than the situation actually felt while it was still unfolding in real time. That gap between lived uncertainty and retold certainty is hindsight bias, just operating at the scale of an entire industry's collective memory instead of one team's post-mortem. Here's the part most managers miss entirely, and it's the part that actually matters if you want to fix any of this. Trying to just be more objective during a post-mortem doesn't work, because hindsight bias doesn't feel like a bias while it's happening. It feels exactly like an accurate memory. There is no internal warning light. Telling a team to try harder to remember what they actually thought is asking them to fight a distortion they can't even detect from the inside. The fix cannot be a mindset. It has to be a structure, something written down before the outcome exists, so nobody's memory gets the chance to quietly edit itself later. One well-documented technique for this, developed and popularized by decision researcher Gary Klein, is called the pre-mortem. Before a project launches, before the campaign runs, before the hire starts, before the merger closes, the team is asked to imagine that it's already a year in the future and the project has failed completely. Not might fail, has failed. Then, working backward from that imagined failure, every person on the team writes down every plausible reason it could have gone wrong, independently, before discussing it as a group. This single exercise does 2 separate, valuable things at once. First, it surfaces real risks. While there's still time to actually do something about them, people are far more willing to voice a concern about a hypothetical failure than to openly criticize a plan their boss just presented with confidence. Second, and just as important for everything we've covered so far, it creates a dated, written record of the genuine uncertainty that existed before anyone knew the outcome. If the project does eventually fail, that pre-mortem document becomes the actual evidence of what was foreseeable and what wasn't, instead of everyone's hindsight-corrupted memory of what they supposedly thought at the time. It's the difference between a courtroom with a written contract and a courtroom with only people's competing recollections. The second structural fix is the decision journal, a practice closely associated with investors and decision researchers like Michael Mauboussin. Before a significant decision, a hire, a campaign, a pricing change, a strategic bet, write down 4 things: what you're deciding, why you're deciding it, what you expect to happen as a result, and how confident you actually are in that expectation. Store that document somewhere nobody can quietly edit later, with a timestamp that can't be disputed. Then, when the results eventually come in, whatever they turn out to be, compare the actual outcome against that original written document, not against anyone's memory of what they supposedly thought at the time. This matters because memory always cheats in hindsight's favor, every single time, for everyone, without exception. That's not a character flaw, it's just how memory works. A dated written record doesn't have that problem. It says exactly what you expected and how sure you were, frozen at the moment you wrote it, immune to whatever happens afterward. Reading your own 6-month-old decision journal entry back, after you already know how things turned out, is one of the more humbling exercises available to any manager, and also one of the most useful. Here's the part that actually changes how a manager should run a post-mortem meeting, starting with the very first question asked. Stop asking, "Why didn't we see this coming?" That question already assumes the outcome was knowable in advance, which is precisely the assumption hindsight bias has already planted in everyone's head before the meeting even starts. Ask a different question instead. Given only what we actually knew and wrote down at the time, was this a reasonable decision? That single change in the framing does something important. It separates judging the decision from judging the outcome, and separating those two things is the entire difference between a post-mortem that produces useful lessons and one that just produces a convenient scapegoat. In practice, this means opening the pre-mortem document, or the decision journal entry first, before anyone starts reconstructing memories out loud. Let the dated, written record set the terms of the conversation. Only after everyone has re-anchored to what was actually known and expected at the time should the conversation move to what happened and why. Skip that step, and hindsight bias will quietly run the entire meeting without anyone noticing, exactly the way it always does. What makes hindsight bias unusually stubborn, compared with most cognitive biases, is that it never announces itself. Anxiety feels like anxiety. Frustration feels like frustration. But a hindsight-distorted memory feels exactly like an ordinary, accurate memory. There's no internal flag, no hesitation, no sense that anything has been altered. It often teams up with a related pattern where people judge their own past choices generously and everyone else's past choices harshly, treating their own good outcomes as skill and someone else's bad outcomes as something that should have been obvious to avoid. Put those two distortions together in one room, and you get a post-mortem, where an entire team walks out having confidently punished someone for a failure that genuinely could not have been predicted at the time, fully convinced that justice was done. Nobody planned to be unfair. The bias did the planning for them, quietly, in the background, using only information that didn't even exist yet at the moment the original decision was made. Here's the part of this I find genuinely strange, the piece most people skip past. Hindsight bias isn't really a story about individual memory at all. It's a story about how organizations quietly manufacture their own risk aversion, one unfair post-mortem at a time, without a single person in the building ever deciding to make the company more cautious. Nobody holds a meeting and votes to become risk-averse. It just accumulates, meeting after meeting, as every bad outcome gets retroactively relabeled as foreseeable, and every person who made a reasonable bet that didn't pay off quietly learns to make smaller, safer, easier to defend bets next time. A few years of that, compounding across every team in a company, and you get an organization that describes itself as wanting bold thinking while structurally punishing anyone who actually tries it. The fix isn't a training session or a poster in the break room about embracing failure. It's 2 boring documents, a pre-mortem and a decision journal, that simply exist before the outcome does, so the story can't quietly rewrite itself later. That's the whole mechanism. Write it down before you know how it ends, and hindsight loses its only real weapon. So here's what to actually do with this. Before your next real decision, a hire, a campaign, a pricing change, a bet on a new market, write down what you expect to happen and how confident you are, and put a date on it. Before your next project launch, run a 5-minute pre-mortem. Imagine it already failed, and have everyone write down why, independently, before the group discussion starts. And the next time a post-mortem meeting starts with someone saying the signs were all there, ask to see the actual pre-mortem or decision journal from before the project began. If it's not there, treat that sentence with real suspicion, because it's very likely hindsight talking, not memory. Judge the decision against the documented reasoning that existed before the outcome was known, never against the outcome by itself. Do that consistently, across enough decisions, and something shifts in how a team behaves. People stop hiding their real thinking behind safe, easily defensible choices because they know, going in, that they'll be judged on the quality of the bet itself, not just on whether the dice happen to land their way afterward. A project fails, and by the very next Monday, someone in that room will say they saw it coming. The honest answer, almost every single time, is that they didn't. Their memory just got there first, quietly rewriting the past the moment the outcome became known, and handing them a false sense of certainty they never actually had. The manager who catches that sentence and asks for the paper trail instead of the memory is the one who actually learns something from the failure, instead of just finding someone convenient to blame for it. Follow along for more of these.